Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to cover how I created this scene using geometry nodes and particles. And I've used Blender version 2.92. There are a number of improvements that will be coming with Blender 2.93, but as I make this it's still in alpha, so I'd rather make a tutorial using released versions. For my Patreons I will be uploading this blend file for them to play with as they wish, but I will go through how I created the elements of this scene. And you can see I've rendered it at a reasonably high resolution, so we can see a fair bit of detail in there. So what we basically got is a number of different trees. That was some kind of banana plant. We've got some ferns, some grass plants running around the edge of the stream. We've got a stream in the middle and a number of flattened rocks around the stream. And there's texture on both the rocks and the stream bank. So to begin with, let's just create our blank scene. And I started off just with a simple plane to begin with, and we'll scale that up a bit and apply the scale. I find it to be relatively important when using geometry nodes to keep applying the scale and the rotation to your objects, otherwise you can get some unexpected effects until you apply it. So immediately go into edit mode and right click and say subdivide, and we'll open this up here and we'll add a few more subdivisions, perhaps just that many. Then I'm going to right click again and say subdivide again, so it's further subdivided it, but I'm going to add fractal this time, as that will start to give us some variations in the surface. And I'll increase the number of subdivisions a bit, and we can scale on the Z just to get that up a bit there, and then perhaps we'll subdivide once more and just turn that perhaps even up a little higher. I'm going to put a subdivision surface on this anyway. Scale on the Z a little more, I think, and then Control 2 just to smooth that surface off. So that's added a level 2 subdivision surface and shade smooth. So that's the start of our ground. What I also did was just select the borders, press O to turn on proportional editing, and then GZ, and just lift up the edge a bit. And in fact, what I'm going to do is Control plus and then lift the edge up like that. Really just so that you don't see straight through as if you're looking across the edge of a cliff necessarily. And then Control minus, and that now just reduces the selection to where I started. Turn off proportional editing and then GZ again, so that we don't quite see from ground level. I'm even reducing the size of the lumps and bumps there by scaling on the Z, so that you don't see the very edge of the mesh. You see a curved edge, and that means particles will be produced and rolled over the edge potentially. So next I wanted to create some kind of stream in the middle, and there's of course a variety of ways we can do that. Gone into orthographic view there, unselect everything, press C to select, and then we'll just create some kind of winding path. You may need to increase the amount of vertices in the object. We'll click here and we'll go plus under vertex groups, give that a name, we'll call that stream, and we'll assign. So if we now go into weight paint mode, you can see there is our stream, and we can adjust that a little bit here and there. It's relatively crude because we don't have that many vertices. We can fix that, of course. I'll select them all and say subdivide, but this time I'm going to turn fractal off, and we'll turn smoothness up, so it'll actually smooth out some of the hard edges, and that will allow us to have a slightly less stepped selection here. Not that it matters too much because we're not going to directly see this selection. It's just about areas we don't want trees and where we do want stones and things like that. So all I'm doing here is just smearing the selection, and now I just smooth them a little bit just so that we've got a bit of a bank. I'm going to go back to edit mode, and I'm going to select the area that I have selected. I'm going to shrink it a bit because there is a bank there. Then with proportional editing switched on, I'm going to press S for scale and Z and reduce the scale a little bit, perhaps not have that proportional editing too big, and then GZ to lower it a little bit. And I'm just reducing that scale, that proportional editing size down a little bit as I go. I don't want it very deep, I just want it to be slightly lower than the surrounding area. I'm going to name this plane ground. I'm going to add another plane, and we'll call this water. We'll scale it up to around the size of the main plane, and then what I'm also going to do is just add a new material which we will call water. We'll just give it a sort of default color at the moment. especially under the viewport display. And then we'll lower that to around here. Now you can see I am going to need to adjust the stream area a little bit. So I'm going to shrink that in slightly and GZ, and we'll lift this area up. It's fine if it's a little shallow in some areas because that's what a stream as opposed to a river or lake would be. I'm going to look from above. I've got my ground selected, select everything in edit mode and just press U and unwrap. I didn't bother applying the scale to the water at the moment. I may do later, but it's not really necessary because I'm not going to be adding any geometry nodes or particles to that. So I'm going to explain how I created the assets, but that really is a lot of hours of work. So I'm going to ultimately import the assets from another scene, but I'll talk about how we create each one. So to begin with, let's create some rocks. So if we add under mesh, we should have the rock generator. If it's not there, just go to edit, preferences, add-ons, and make sure add mesh rocks is there, but it should be on by default anyway. So you can see it's already created a rock. I can say how many rocks I want to create up here. I can then play with the scale on the X and the Y. It keeps adding a new random to the rock, which is why it keeps changing shape. But what I suggest is go for flatter rocks if you want a stream bed. I didn't have huge numbers of rocks, so you can also perhaps decrease the roughness of the rock a little bit, but increase the detail level slightly. And we can even add a smoothness factor there because they're obviously been smoothed in the water. So there is a rock, and you want to create probably at least half a dozen of those, at least 5 or 6 of those, each one different. And if you want to, of course, you can play around with them afterwards to make them flatter if you need to. But note that this is still an object with modifiers on. You can apply those modifiers or you can leave it as it is. So I'm going to just import some rocks now. We can do that by appending. So you find the file that has your objects in, select open, and then go to the object folder. It looks like a folder. And then as long as you've named your things appropriately, and hopefully I did, you should be able to find what you're looking for. So you can see I've got some rocks here. So I'm going to select those and just say append. You can link, and what linking does is it means if you go back to the original file and change the objects in there, the objects will be updated even in your new file. So there are my rocks. They're all the way over there. So let's bring them here where we can see them. I'll delete that one. And you can see they were created in exactly the same way, and they are just fairly generic looking rocks, but quite flat. One thing with particle systems, using particularly the hair system, is if I had a particular rotation of the particle that I needed, it had to be a particular orientation, I'd always have to rotate them on the y-axis 90 degrees in order for them to stand upright, such as trees and things like that, whereas I haven't found that to be so much the case with GeoNodes. But let's just open another window up and go to the shader editor, because I've also got a material on these rocks. So you can see the material there. It looks relatively complicated, but let's just go through it a bit at a time. So this is texture coordinate node. The rocks have not been unwrapped. We need to be able to map a texture in some form onto the rocks. And if I didn't put this texture coordinate, it would all be just mixed up. We wouldn't get a texture at all. So let's just look at the object element, come back to this area in a little bit. And there you can see our basic rock texture. So the one we've got is the layered 0002, which is that one. So you can see that's the rock texture I'm using. I got that from CG Textures. And that is fed, we'll ignore this mix node for a moment, into the principled shader. In fact, if I just wire that straight in, you can see there is our rock texture. But I wanted to do something else with that. One of the things I wanted to do was to add sort of patches of moss into there. So again, based on the object texture coordinate, which generally works better than generated, I had a noise texture, and that fed into a color ramp. So that's just giving us patches. And then that controlled a mix node with 2 versions of green on it. I'm thinking moss. And that went into this overlay node here. Now we'll ignore the overlay node for the moment and just come straight through. So ignore that. That comes through. This gamma node really is just for sort of making the color stronger and darker. And then that went into one side of this mix node. So essentially I've got a patchy green color, patchy between these 2 greens here, coming into one side of this node. I've got my rock texture on the top side of the node, and then I've got another noise texture here. As it happens, I ended up using the generated output. It's no specific reason you could use the object texture coordinate. Again, controlled through this color ramp so that I can control the sharpness of the fall off, and then that controls that mix node. So that's just basically giving us a noise texture, a very low frequency noise texture. So if I change this, you can see how that affects it. If I go up high, we get a lot more patches of moss. If I go down low, we'll get far fewer but larger patches of moss, and this controls the fall off, so we can go to a point where there's almost no moss to areas where the moss is quite thick, but you want a bit of fall off on there obviously. So that's controlling the mix between those two textures, and then that's just being fed into our principled shader. I'll talk about these in a minute. So then coming down here, the noise for the moss is a relatively high frequency, as it were, or high scale. If I change that, you can see it's affecting the individual areas here. So it's as though you've got different colors within the moss, which you look at moss, it does look a bit like that from a distance. And again, this varies how sharp the fall off between bright and dark is, which is what controls this mix. But I've also got another one here, same setup, different scale, a much lower scale, and this was to give larger variations across larger areas of the colour of the moss. So perhaps some of the moss has dried out and gone a bit yellow. So I've got a smaller scale, which gives you of course larger lumps or areas that are affected, again going through a colour ramp so that we can tweak it, and then going into this mix node set to overlay with this orangey colour. So you can see as I play with this, it sort of darkens the moss slightly. Maybe it's dried out a little bit, but again, exactly how you mix those together is up to you. But that just adds another depth to the moss. I've also taken a feed off this initial moss texture into the height of a bump node, set to about 0.25, and then that feeds into the normal. So that gives you some shadowing, because obviously the moss is a textured surface. That's also actually being applied even where there isn't moss, just to add a bit of extra texture to the stone. If I wanted to be completely accurate, I ought to switch between two different principled nodes, with one for the moss and one for the stone, but we don't see them close up, so I didn't do that. In order to add more surface texture as well, more shadow effects, I've got another texture coordinate just because it was easier to have it here than have a line stretching over, feeding into a noise texture as usual, somewhat higher scale this time, through a multiply node, which is really just to scale the texture, because by default it varies between 0 and 1, and that would be much too big in general terms. If I set this to 1, you can see it's a bit too extreme, so I generally have this set to something like 0.1, and then it's just a subtle effect on the surface, I guess a bit like sand grains or something like that. Although there's quite a few nodes there, it's relatively simple, and arguably most of them won't make a huge difference to the end result of the scene, just depending on how you use it. But of course you never know quite what you're going to do with the scene until you've built it. So it's worth bearing in mind you might need higher detail in some respects. So that's created our rocks, and we need to put them in a collection. So let's select each of the rocks, press M and say new collection, and we'll call that, unsurprisingly, rocks. So we'll go back to our ground now, but before we add our rocks, I'll just put a basic texture on the ground. So we'll say new up here, and we'll add texture, which is an image texture, connect that into there, and we'll go to my textures, and I use this one, basically leaves on the ground. Now it's too large at the moment, so I could put a mapping node in there, or I can just go to the UV editor, go into edit mode, make sure the whole mesh is selected, make sure you've got your ground texture selected, select the whole mesh in the UV editor, and then scale it up, and you can see everything gets quite a bit smaller. If it's not a tileable mesh, you will get lines, but of course we're not going to see most of the ground, so it shouldn't be too much of a problem. However, I don't want the whole ground covered, so I'm going to do a couple of things about that. So we go back to the shader editor, and I'm going to add another texture, which is the same texture, but now I will add a mapping node. I'll put that there and join that into the vector input there. I'm going to add an input, which is a texture coordinate node. We've UV unwrapped this, so I can take the output straight to there and to there. So at the moment, it's the same texture in both cases. And I'm going to add color mix node and drop that there and put the other texture into the other side. Now, just to make it easier to see what's going to happen, you can see that if I go from one side to the other, nothing changes because the textures are identical right now. But I changed the rotation of one of them for the Z axis to 100 degrees. So you can see something moved there. And now if I shade between one and the other, you may be able to see that they've rotated, unsurprisingly. So we can see there's a line there, and if I shade to the other one, that line isn't there. There will be other lines, you can see one there. So the idea is now that we're going to chop and change between those two to hide some of those lines, to make them less obvious anyway. So we'll lift that up there a little bit, and we're going to add a texture which is a noise texture. We'll also add a converter, which is a color ramp. Put the factor of the noise into the color ramp, and then just to see what we're doing, I'll take the output of that color ramp straight into my principled shader. So if we zoom out, you can see there's a sort of faint variation there. But if I narrow this color ramp in, you can see that changes a bit. I can plug in my UV unwrapping and then play around with the scale. If we look through the camera, which I haven't set up yet, but at least it gives you a general idea. The individual patches may be a bit small, so let's go down to 2, maybe even 1. And then we play around with the settings on our color ramp. And I used ease just to sort of blend the edges of the patches a little bit. So we've created a patchy mask, as it were. So I'll put my texture back in there, and then I will plug the output of my color ramp into the factor on that mix node. And now, although it won't have completely hidden anything, what it's done is you'll only get a small amount of a line, for example, before one of those patches gets in the way and shows the differently oriented texture, and therefore breaks them up quite a bit. They're not at all as obvious. And of course you could put more of these on if it was particularly important. So that's given us a basic texture for the ground of our jungle, but it doesn't give us any kind of surface texture. So I'm just going to unplug the texture for a minute, and I'm going to add another color ramp. I'm going to move these two over slightly. I'm going to put our mixed texture into the color ramp. Again, let's just see what that's doing for a moment. And then I'm just going to narrow it in, and the idea is that certain parts will be bright, but we'll have dark patches as well. So these are going to be raised areas in the land. I'm now going to add under vector a bump node, take that input into the height input on the bump node, and then take that into the normal input on the principled shader. And you can see we've now got some artifacts appearing on the surface. And for me, I found a strength of about 0.3 to be sufficient. If you go too high, it starts to look a little odd. Maybe go a little higher than that so we can just start to see it. Now I haven't got any lights in the scene yet, so I need to do that, but I'll take my texture back in there. We're in preview mode now, so it's going to be limited in what it can display anyway. And you can see we've got a bit of a line there. So just adjusted my color ramp and that vanished most of that. Finally, I added a gamma node in here just so that I could darken the leaf litter a little. I had that set to about 1.6, and another noise texture. Again, this is just adding another layer of detail. Take that into displacement, and I'll add under converters a math node set to multiply. I left it at 0.5. but I turned the scale of the noise up to 750 and the detail up to 16. And that just gives, again, a little bit of surface detail. Maybe turn that down slightly to 0.3. So I'm now going to start to add a little bit of light into the scene so we can preview it, but I'll just position the camera slightly. So I've selected the camera and I'll just bring it down here. Come up to here, the world properties, say use node, and we'll click in here and say sky texture. Should note here that I'm doing this render in cycles mode. You can equally well do it in Eevee, but there will be a few little limitations under Eevee. I used the Hosek Wilkie method and just turn this little ball up to the one side slightly. It does simulate the sun, but I like to add my own sun because I can play around with it more easily. I'm going to add a lamp or light, which is a sun lamp. It's often easy to make your scenes too dark. Even if you want a dark scene, you still need quite a lot of light in order to see something that may seem just right to you, maybe way too dark on one person's setup and way too bright on another. But generally it's not quite that bad, but nevertheless, if your scene's already very, very dark, there will be a lot of occasions when it will just be a black screen almost for some people. Bear that in mind. So we've got a sun in the scene. I'll set that to a slightly yellow color, and I had mine to a brightness of about 3. So let's go to render preview. So there we are. Got some interesting shadows there, so I'll leave it as it is for the time being. I ended up with the sun actually behind the scene, so almost pointing into the camera, because that gave me some nice reflections off the surface of the water. And I guess now is a good time to do a little bit of work on that. So it's not such a complicated node setup for the water. So I tried various different options and I decided on a glass and transparent shader as the most effective for this scene. So to begin with, select the water. Here's our basic principled shader. I'm going to delete the principled shader and I'm going to add a glass shader, connect that in. I'm just going to turn down the number of samples here to 16. 64. I'll say adaptive sampling, and under light paths I'm going to turn off reflective and refractive caustic, because that will also help to minimize some of the noise in the scene, because this is a cycles render. So I gave the water a very slightly greenish hue, very slight, and an index of refraction of 1.33, which is the right value for water. But I've never been satisfied with just using the glass shader for water. I'm now going to add a mix shader and then add transparent shader. Make sure the transparent shader is full white and take that into the other side of the mix shader. So on the one side there's our water, on the other it seems to vanish. So here it's completely reflective and it's showing the ground behind it. I added a very small roughness to the water, 0.01. But there's going to be more done to that surface in a moment. Now I'm going to add an input which is layer weight, and I'll take the facing output into the mix shader, and I set the blend value to about 0.2. So this is looking at the angle at which light is bouncing off the surface of the water and essentially changing between the glass shader and the transparent shader based on that. And as we add some surface ripples, that will become more significant. So now I'm going to add under vector a bump node and connect that into the normal input on the glass shader and the normal input on our layer weight node. And finally, I'm going to add a texture which is a wave texture, and plug that, color or factor, doesn't matter too much, into the height of the bump node. See, it looks a bit insane at the moment. So to start with, I'm going to set this to a scale of 32. See, it's starting to have an effect now. Distortion of 9, so that makes the line sort of wobbly. I turn the detail scale up slightly to 1.5 and then set the strength of the bump map 0.125. So you can now see we've got a very easy ripply surface. You can do more than that. You can put extra noise effects in there and so on. Even just a noise shader will give you a pretty good effect, especially if you add distortion to it. I'm actually going to turn that down slightly. It's a little too high even there. That starts to give me the idea of a rippled water surface. So now I can play with the sunlight, rotate on the Z, and let's just move that around and see how that changes. If I change this window up here to the 3D viewport, and I'll just move the sun over here. Not that it makes any difference where it is physically, it's purely about the angle. And we can raise that up like that. I think I prefer sun coming from that side. It gives a bit more colour to the ground. So we'll go with that for now. So we're now ready to start adding some assets to the scene. So we'll come up to here and we'll go to geometry nodes, and I've got the ground selected now, and we'll say new, and we get our basic geometry appearing there. If I disconnect this, the ground disappears completely. I'm just going to go to preview mode now so things speed up a little. You can see we've just got our water there. So I'll connect that back. Now, I've covered the basics of geometry nodes in a couple of previous tutorials, so I'll go a little quickly here. Now, we could add all of the assets, the particles if you like, in one set of geometry nodes. The problem with that is it makes it harder to be able to turn individual things on and off and play with individual effects. So what I tend to do is to add individual geometry node setups for each asset, each item that I'm going to put into the scene. So I can click in here or up there, and I can put rocks here, for example. So I now know this is the rocks geometry node, and I need to change it there as well. And the first thing I'm going to do is add under point instance. So drop that in there, and immediately the land has disappeared. We'll come back to that in a moment. If I click in here, you can see a number of assets have appeared. So I'm going to change this to collection, turn off whole collection. I don't want to be instancing the whole collection. I want to pick from the collection. And now I can select my rocks collection. So if I zoom out, you can now see we have a lot of rocks. They're all rather large, but you can see they are following the contours of the ground. I'm going to make them smaller before I go into anything else. So I'm going to add an attribute, which is attribute randomize. Drop that in there, change it to vector, because this is going to be scale that we're affecting. Click in here and type scale. I think in later versions you'll actually get offered these as options, but at the moment we have to type it in. So what this is now doing is changing the scale of each rock that it instances between the minimum and the maximum. Now at the moment the maximum is too big. I don't want a minimum of 0, so let's change the minimum to 0.1, but let's set the maximum to 0.2. Certainly a lot smaller, but they're all over the place. I don't want this many rocks, and I don't want them distributed everywhere. So I'm going to add under point a point distribute node, and we'll drop that there. And now you can see what it's doing is it's giving us a random distribution with this density, 1 as it happens. So it's better, but obviously our landscape has vanished at the moment. So how can we bring our landscape back? Obviously we could create another version of it, but there's a much easier way to do that. We'll add under geometry a join geometry node. Let's put that on the bottom, it doesn't really matter too much. And then take the original geometry into there, and that will join the two together, and now we've got our land back again. So we can now see our rocks and our land. You can see it a bit more clearly there. But at the moment the rocks are everywhere. I don't particularly want them distributed so evenly. I think most of the visible rock would be around the stream bed. But before I worry about that, I want to play around with the rotation of my rocks a little. I think I'll also tweak some scale on them slightly as well. So let's go to 0.125 on the X size of our rocks, 0.125 on the Z as well. So you can see that's made them much flatter, and we'll make the minimum size of our rocks smaller as well. So we'll go for 0.05. So now what I want to do is just play around with the rotation of our rocks. So I'll just copy that attribute randomize node and drop that in there. Click in here and change that to rotation. I'll set the minimum to 0. I think this works in radians, so we'll leave those at 0, but the maximum, something like that. And the seed value will just give you different distributions, in this case different distributions of rock, but they're still scattered everywhere. So how can I get them to just be around the stream bed? Well, if you remember, we've got a vertex group called stream. So if I click in here and type stream, suddenly they're only in this area. You can see them there. We need more of them, but that's where they are. I think I'll make the largest rocks a little larger now, and the smallest ones even smaller. And now it's just a matter of selecting the density that works for our scene. So I'm just turning that up a bit there. Many of these rocks are below the surface of the water, but may still be visible, of course. So just adjusting some of the dimensions of the rocks a little bit. So if we have a look at that, that's starting to give us the sort of look that we want. And if you get a rock that's sticking up like that, you can play around with the geometry, or just more simply, just choose a different seed for the distribution, and that rock will be gone. Okay, so that's a good start for our rocks. So now we can import some more assets. I'm not going to go through quite as many as I did, but I'll import a few just so that we can see what we're doing. So I'll append, and let's do the fern plant, or we'll take the banana plants, the ferns, etc. We'll append those first of all. I think I've made this scene quite a bit smaller than my other one. So having rescaled them, I will need to apply the scale to these objects. So that's just Control A and apply. So we've got a number of assets here. So here are some grass plants. So I've selected all my grass plants, press M, new collection, grass. These are my banana plants. So this is literally just a banana leaf edited in Photoshop to give it a transparent background, and then imported in with images as planes and a bit of geometry added. So I'll just show you what that looks like from a node setup standpoint. It's not that complicated. So there's our principled shader. There is the image of a leaf. Color goes into the color input on the principled shader. I've also got it feeding into a translucent node, and then there's an add shader which adds the diffuse and reflective output from the principled shader to that translucent, and then that is our material output. So what that gives you is obviously light shining through the leaves, or shadows cast across the leaf, and then light shining through the areas where the light passes. So it just gives you a little bit more realism. I'm using the alpha output into the alpha input, and that gives us essentially the chopped off leaf. If you look at it without the text here, you can see these are relatively square planes. I haven't given them any thickness. That doesn't work very well with alphas. And I could probably turn the roughness down even further than where it is actually. They're relatively shiny objects, albeit not completely shiny. What I have done in the past is I've actually added a gamma node into the input of the translucent, just to make the color a little darker or more intense when it's going through the leaf. And you can see I've just distributed the leaves around them. And then basically a very similar sort of effect for the ferns. I've got a few extra nodes in here. So this one, for example, object info. This allows me to create a random value that is different every time I instance a fern. I'm then multiplying that down a little bit by 0.75 and adding 0.9. So basically scaling it slightly as a number, and then using that to affect the gamma node here, which just basically changes the saturation. So what that will do is just give me ferns which look slightly different each time I use them. Here's the texture here. And again, I'm adding in a translucent. This looks slightly more complicated because these don't actually have a translucent background, so I'm having to create a mask. And then I'm adding a little bit of surface texture with this Verona texture. But if you've got a translucent map, you can do it in exactly the same way as I did this one. So we'll just make a new collection with the banana plants and a new one for the ferns. And you can see it tidies things up a lot as well up here. There are a couple of other plants too, but I won't worry about those. So if we come back to our modifiers, I'm just going to click in here and say duplicate. So I've created a duplicate of the rocks geometry nodes, but I'm going to click in here so that it's a unique duplicate, and I'm now going to turn off the visibility of the rocks, and I'll just turn this one back on again. So I'm going to call this one banana, and we'll go to the geometry node. You need to make sure the right node is selected, because as you can see, it's a different geometry node setup up here depending on which of these is selected. So I don't want these to necessarily run along the stream, so I'm going to delete that for the moment. And I don't want rocks, I want bananas. In fact, I want bananas. So we've got rather a lot of them at the moment, and they're a bit of a funny shape. So we'll go for a min size of 0.1 for the moment and a max size of 1 and see how that looks. So that's a banana plantation, clearly, possibly a little larger than we want. So we'll go for 0.5 as the max size, and obviously that's rather more than we want, so we can turn the density down quite a bit. But we've still got some bananas growing in the middle of the stream. So we could do something fancy with math nodes and things like that to invert the stream density, or we can make life easy on ourselves. And we'll create a new vertex group. I've called it plants and trees. Go into edit mode, select everything, and assign. So that's basically created a vertex group covering the whole geometry. Now unselect everything. I just pressed A twice to do that. Go to our stream and say select. So that's brought up our stream vertex group. Go back to our plants and trees and just say remove. Now if I unselect everything and just say select, you can see where we've got stream in stream vertex group, we haven't got anything. We might need to expand this selection slightly. So I'll now come out of edit mode and we'll go into here, widen that out a bit, and we'll put plants and trees. So there you see they've cleared away from the stream, and as I thought, I probably do need to expand that selection slightly. So let's just go up to here and I'll just press plus once and assign. And if we play around with the density, we can see what's going on, and we may want to go into weight paint mode because I probably want plants and trees coming right down to the water. So you can see I'm just blurring that weight in slightly. That's just bringing them down the bank. It's good to have variation, so some clear areas and some areas that are not so clear. So that's the banana plants added. So we can do the same process, perhaps turn the number of banana plants down slightly. They are a large plant, and that will mean we can have them a little bigger then as well. By the way, if you ever want to be able to get density or the seed value very quickly without having to go into the geometry nodes themselves, we can just take this seed value here, for example, and just pull it out to there. And now you can see that seed value has appeared under here. And if we press N, we can select that and we can give it a name. So it could be banana seed. So that means I can just go into this node when I want to and just play around with this here, and it's changing the seed value, in other words the distribution for the bananas, which you may well want to do when you're using this sort of setup. And you can do that for any of these things, of course. Let's just turn off the visibility of the bananas and then duplicate that one, open it up, and let's just click the little 2 there. If we don't do that, we'll be affecting the original node setup as well. So this one we'll call ferns, and in there as well, point instance should be the ferns, and we'll make it visible. And we probably want a few more ferns than that, so we can change that here. And they can probably be a little bigger, so we could try 1. And we'll turn the density up a little, and again play with the seed. So there's some ferns, and duplicate again, turn off the ferns visibility, click the little 2, and we'll call this one grass. Point of note, if you leave the seed values the same, and all other elements are the same, even if it's a different object, the density is the same and so on, then objects will appear on top of each other. That's part of the reason for needing a seed value, so that you can redistribute them even if they are the same density. So we'll come up here and we'll select grass. Now those are quite large for grass, so we'll go for 0.05 as the lowest value, and maybe 0.3 perhaps 0.5 for the largest value. However, we can go for a much higher density for the grass. Yeah, that might still be a little big. So if we turn all of those on, we still don't have any trees, of course, and see how that's looking. It's certainly getting there. I would say the grass needs to be much higher. Now, if you run into a problem where you're having to put so many particles on, but you're not necessarily going to see all of the particles, then we've got all these areas out here which arguably we don't really need particles or instanced objects on because we're not even looking there. We might move the camera around a little bit to find the scene we want, but even if it was an animation, we probably would never see the grass over here. So let's turn all of these off for a moment and let's go back to our vertex groups and our plants and trees particularly. So I'm going to select nothing. I am going to go to wireframe though, because some objects may need to be instanced just over a hill, as it were. What I'm selecting now is all the areas that might potentially have plants or trees on them. I'm going to go slightly wider than the camera. If nothing else, there'll be shadows and perhaps leaves coming in from the outside, especially close to the camera. I'm now going to go up to select and say invert, and then just say remove. So that's now taken away all of the vertices from that vertex group that are not in the view of the camera, or at least some way outside of the view of the camera. So I now turn my object's visibility back on. You can see the density appears to have gone up, and that's of course because we've still got the same number of objects, but they're now being concentrated into areas of the scene that we can see. So I think we can make the bananas, select those geometry nodes. I think they can afford to be a little bigger, particularly on the X and Y, and perhaps the ferns as well. See, that's making them slightly wider. And with the grass, I think we can go even higher. Perhaps not that high. We'll go for 500. And with the grass particularly, we might want a bit more variation in its angle. See that's coming on now. So I'm just going to turn off the other nodes. So at the moment, I'm only rotating it. But if I put a little bit of variation here, then not all of our grass will be bolt upright. And of course we can do that with some of the others as well. Perhaps the bananas will just give a little bit of variation here. So this is our attribute randomize rotation node. So finally, we need to just add some trees. I use the sapling generator. You can model your own trees however you want to do it, but you need to make several different versions. I did add a few more different plants into the scene as well. This is just the tutorial version, as it were. But I'll append some more assets, which is now going to be some trees. Some of them had leaves and some of them didn't. So we'll append those. There they are. We'll scale them down a bit and we'll put them over here, I think. We'll apply the scale and of course we'll give them a new collection, which is trees. We won't use the grass one because there was rather a lot of grass, but we use our banana geometry node setup as the starting point and we'll say duplicate. We'll drag that down here, open it up, click the little 2, and we'll rename this one trees. Still got the word banana seed down there. If we want to change that, we can call that tree seed, and we'll make it visible, and we'll change that to trees. So we probably want to make those a little larger, but we don't want them to vary by quite as much. So I'll put that up to something like 0.5 and the max size, well, certainly 1. And then we'll play around with the tree seed, distribute them around. And now if we turn on everything, we can start to see what sort of scene we're getting. And that tree's a bit central, so I'll select a different seed. So we get a different tree central, so I'll increase it again. And I think that's starting to make quite a nice scene. It's not quite a jungle yet, but we'll give that a render and then we'll see how that goes. So there's an initial render and it's looking good. And I think we can make a few adjustments now. I think I've got about the same density of trees as banana plants right now. I think the trees could be slightly larger and there could be more of them. I've got quite a few of these leafless trees as well. So with the tree geometry nodes selected, let's turn the density of the trees up slightly. So just increasing it there, and let's adjust the scale slightly. So we've got this one here, which is scale. Again, we could drag these outside if we wanted to. So I'm happy with the minimum scale, but let's go to 1.5 on the max scale. So now we're seeing a lot less of the sky. Perhaps the grass could do with being slightly smaller. So we'll go for 0.25 on that. And to compensate for making it smaller, I'll increase the density a little bit. We'll go to 750. Now, if I go back to my render for a moment, one of the other things you notice is I only rendered 64 samples, which is quite low for a cycles render, but it still took quite a while. There's a lot for the machine to render here. But you can see it's, especially around the water, it's quite noisy. So we want to use denoising. I could use the automatic denoising, but I think you get a slightly better result from using the compositing denoise option. Plus you can turn it off if you want to render a little more quickly. So if we go to the compositor now and we say use nodes, there's our basic scene. And I want to add a filter, which is the denoise filter. Now I can just take this into here and that out to there, and you'll see some processing go on, and it will be a denoised image. It takes a little while, but I believe that's not entirely the correct way to do it. It's more of a blur if you do that. And it works. You can see it's a much smoother image now if I zoom out. It's not completely blurry, but I think it's not as accurate in terms of the denoising effect, but still a perfectly acceptable image. What I really want to do is if I come over to here, under passes, turn on denoising data, and you'll notice we get a whole load of new options here. Now I haven't rendered it with these on, so there's no data in there at the moment. What I need to do is, and I'm not sure if it really makes much of a difference with whether I use image or noisy image, but I need to take noisy image into there. Obviously I haven't rendered with these passes, so there's nothing going to come through at the moment. Take denoising normal into normal and denoising albedo into albedo. So albedo, I guess, is how much indirect light there is being reflected off an area. The normal is obviously information about the angle of a face relative to the camera, and then obviously the noisy image is what it says it is. And so with that information, more intelligent choices can be made as to how pixels are averaged and blurred and that kind of thing. So you get a more intelligent denoising, at least that's the theory. So we've got that in there. I've adjusted my scene, so we'll give that another render at exactly the same settings other than having this denoise in it. Now again, this denoise isn't going to do anything until after the render's completed. If you use render time denoising, so if you go to here for example and you turn it on there, you do get some choices here depending on what graphics card you've got. It will render a few tiles and then it will go and denoise them, but the problem is you can't make any adjustments to that or take it out or whatever it is you want to do after the fact, whereas if you do it at compositing time you've got more control over it. So we'll give that a run. So there we go. You can see that's a much nicer scene now, and that was only 64 samples. You could argue a more accurate render probably need at least double that, but that's a pretty acceptable quality there. And you can see it's a sort of more interesting scene now with a lot more shadows across things, but it needs a little bit of enhancement, so we can do a little more with the compositing. So the first thing I'll do is a very common one. We'll put a vignette on the scene. So I'm just going to add under matte an ellipse mask. I'm going to set the width to 1 and the height to 0.5. I'm now going to add a color mix node and I'm going to set that to multiply. I'm going to put the ellipse mask output into the bottom input and I'll leave it on a factor of 1 at the moment. And when it's finished recompositing, which is basically that denoise being recalculated, you can see we've got that ellipse, which is quite fun, but that's obviously not what I'm looking for. I'm now going to add another node, which is a blur node, and drop that in there, change that to fast Gaussian, set that to relative, Y, because that's the shortest side, and I normally go for about 15% blur, and we'll just let it composite that. And that's a fairly heavy vignette at the moment, it goes completely black. If you want a less extreme vignette, we can turn it down a little here, and again it will recomposite, and again it will recomposite. The whole scene is a little dark, so we'll do a little processing anyway on that. And we can do this after the vignette or before. I think I'll do it before. So I'm going to add from the color side a gamma node and just drop that in there and just turn the gamma down a little bit. And you can see that's brightened it up. And this is where if you find the denoising is slowing things down a bit too much, if you just select that node and press M, it will just take it out of the equation temporarily. So we've got a noisy scene again, but we can obviously turn the denoising back on when we're ready, and you wouldn't be able to play around in that. So we've changed the gamma, that's where it was, and that's where we have turned it up to, but I'm still not completely happy with the color balance. So under color, put a color balance node in and just drop that in there. And typically, especially with outdoor scenes, we want to set gain a little bit red, gamma, the sort of purpley pinky color, and then lift will go slightly green. It's perhaps a bit too much. So I want to enhance the green, but I also want to enhance the red because I think that's where we're lacking a little bit there. You don't want to go too much because it starts to make the scene look a bit dry. And in this case, I'm looking more for a sort of lush woodland or forest or jungle scene. somewhere around there. You just need to move these around a little bit. And of course you can play with these sliders slightly as well. And then we can unmute our denoise node. So I'll just press M to remove the mute, wait for it to composite. And that's all there is to it. So I will include the original file for my Patreons. Hopefully you can follow along with that. And if you enjoyed this tutorial, please don't forget to click like and subscribe. It helps me out, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.